You can do many things for your mitochondria, but if you're chronically stressed, that those efforts are going to be negated.
Hey there, welcome to the Evolving Ageless podcast. This is the Enlightened Woman's Antidote to Aging, and I'm your host, Michelle Dreilich. And as you already know, I am on a mission to change the way women age. And by doing that, each week I'm joined by experts in all of their respective fields of beauty and clinical and medicine that share the latest and greatest research with us and their experiences with their patients and their findings to help us live and evolve ageless. And so today is a very interesting topic. We're going to geek out a little bit here because, we talk about fatigue. I think as women, we experience fatigue ongoing. What's interesting is as we start to hit 40 and older, we might start having trouble sleeping. But many of us hit the pillow and can't even take 2 breaths before we're sound asleep. But in life, we live in a fast-paced, energetic world, and unfortunately, it leaves us just chronically fatigued. Now, how do we separate that though from just burning the candle at both ends to understanding if we're setting ourselves up for some pretty significant, pretty serious stuff long term? And so my guest today is Dr. Tim Jackson. We are going to talk about all things related to fatigue and something really geeked out, something called mitochondria and mitochondrial function. So, Dr. Tim, it is great to have you here.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for having me. I look forward to this.
Oh, this is going to be a lot of fun. So I gave a little intro. We talked a little bit about this idea that, women, especially in our 40s it could be careers and families and our aging parents, we find ourselves burning the candle at both ends. I always joke and I say I scorch it down the middle just for good measure. And so first of all, let's start off and talk about what is mitochondria? Because some people may not remember from high school biology, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so mitochondria, if you Google it or look on Wikipedia, it's going to say the batteries of your cell. But they do much more than that. They're also an entire signaling system throughout the body. And we inherit our mitochondrial DNA. So we have our regular DNA, which is a double helix, and that's in the nucleus of the cell, in the middle of the cell. And the mitochondria exist outside of that, and they're not in a double helix, and they're not wrapped in those histone proteins. And so, we inherit the majority of our mitochondrial DNA from our mother, but there has been at least one study in the past months showing there's a paternal contribution to mitochondrial DNA. And because mitochondria are not protected by those histones, you can think of histones as like a bodyguard. They don't have them, so they're much more susceptible to free radical damage. And when they get damaged, the more free radicals they produce, the more oxidative stress and inflammation we have.
Oh, that is an amazing. Okay, so that's a great overview, right? Like you can't gather that out of a textbook because it reads too heady, right? So, but what you're saying is if everyone remembers every cell, right? We have a nucleus and our DNA is in the cell, and the DNA is tightly protected because we wouldn't survive. We wouldn't be able to have children and replicate if that DNA were damaged, right? Every cell couldn't replicate. So, but the mitochondria live out in that cytoplasm, out in that cell. And if we remember from high school biology, they're like a factory, right? We always think of ATP, if anyone remembers ATP. Mitochondria are the energy factories, right? They make ATP for us and which gives us our get up and go, right? But what we're hearing is it's more than that. It's the system of communication in our body that, honestly, we never learned this in school. This is even in clinical education, it's not something that's readily taught about the mitochondria. We just think of mitochondria, energy, boosting your energy, and so on. So, okay. So now let's talk about everybody's born with them. I had no idea actually that they were inherited, and that so that explains a lot familial wise when you see generations of people that have mitochondrial dysfunction. So, okay. So they're there, they serve a purpose. They are get up and go and are signaling. So let's talk about what causes them to, we can increase our number of mitochondria?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yep.
Let's talk about that first. How do we make more mitochondria? Because more mitochondria means more energy.
Yeah, so exercise, especially aerobic exercise, was traditionally, 15 years ago, thought of as the only way to increase the number of mitochondria. But now studies on molecular hydrogen and something called Brown's gas, which is a mixture of molecular hydrogen and oxygen, that can help repair the mitochondria you already have, but it also increases the number of mitochondria that are in your body.
Wow. Okay. So yes, I've seen if anyone has seen this, there's a new trend for molecular hydrogen out there. And I've read some of the literature. There's some interesting, really promising stuff in it, and like all things, it's kind of controversial right now as to whether it's actually functioning that way. But it's great to talk to someone that can support that and substantiate it. So, all right. So we can take something that can help with that. But the other key that you just said is really important, right? Because we always, I think, and women fall prey to this too, myself included, where we think of exercise as a way to maintain the way we look, right, on the outside. And then maybe our second thought is that exercise has to do with our cardiovascular health, right? Because I think the media in the 70s and 80s did a great job of explaining that cardiovascular workouts instead of just calling them aerobic workouts, right? So we started thinking of them as helping our heart. But what you're saying is when we perform aerobic exercise activity, running, moving, getting our heart rate up for extended periods of time, that helps us increase the number of mitochondria we have.
Yeah. And so, I don't recommend for hormonal reasons that we can talk about doing, say, an hour of running. From an ancestral standpoint, we just weren't meant to do that, no matter what your genetics are. And so, I recommend at least a minimum of 20 to 25 minutes of cardio a few times a week, because that helps increase your VO2 max, increases mitochondria, increases circulation. But you can also do interval training where you do 30 seconds all out, 2 minutes back to your baseline, 30 seconds all out. And that helps to stimulate your anabolic hormones. So growth hormone, testosterone primarily, and DHEA. And so if you do steady state cardio for too long, you're going to increase, basically, I call it a cortisol bath. So you're basically becoming catabolic. And that's why if you look at a lot of marathon runners, they're skinny, but they're skinny fat. So they have a lot of loose, sagging skin, even if they're young. And if you look at the cardiac enzyme levels of people who just finished a marathon, they're very, very similar to those of people who just had a heart attack.
Wow. So that really plays well with this idea of doing, HIIT, high intensity interval training, mixing your cardio with weight in between so that your heart rate comes back down while you're still in an active exercise state. And I think what's really nice about that is it lets you work out less time too, right? So that you're not, the 80s. I always remember those. I'm dating myself now. I'm in my 50s. So those shiny tights we used to wear to the gym, right? And we get on a treadmill and run and walk for like an hour and a half, thinking we were burning off what we ate all day, And so anyone that's in that mindset and mentality, you're on a hamster wheel. There's a way to break that cycle. And in fact, what you're suggesting is you lose muscle through that process when you're just catabolic means you're breaking down parts of your body, and muscle is one of those first things that break down.
Yeah, when you do resistance training, you're increasing what's called EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And so you're burning more calories throughout the day. You're building a metabolic engine, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Whereas, people that were in the mindset that you spoke of, they would say, oh, I exercised this long and I burnt this many calories. But when you build muscle, you're going to burn calories all throughout the day, even when you're not working out.
Right. Which in essence, you're raising your metabolism. That's what that is. Right. When we talk about weight, there are all these things on the market to raise your metabolism. But the way you really raise your own metabolism permanently is by increasing your muscle mass. So that's great. So, and that plays a role with mitochondria, right? Bringing it back again. So can you connect those, muscle and mitochondria?
Yeah. So depending on the tissue type, the number of mitochondria that each cell has will differ. And so the tissue concentrated with mitochondria are the heart, the brain, and the liver and GI tract. Skeletal muscles also have a fair amount. They're kind of in the middle when it comes to the number of mitochondria. And so, we have these 3 different types of muscle fibers: type 1, type 2A, type 2B. The type 2A, those are the ones we can influence through training, through the type of exercise that we do. And so that will dictate, how many new mitochondria we make and how well we repair our mitochondria.
So that's key. I was going to ask you that question too, which is, when you talked about aerobic exercise and creating mitochondria, but not necessarily, you didn't mention healing it. So you can repair your mitochondria with muscle.
Right. With muscle and and of course, proper nutrition and environmental signals. There's so many environmental toxicants that interfere with mitochondrial function today. And we can, talk about the major ones.
Let's get into that. So now what we've covered is, what are mitochondria? We know that. We've covered how do you get more of them, because more is better in this case. I know where Americans tend to be more is better, but this is an example of where more is better always. So, now we know how you get them. So now let's talk about what happens when they're or how do you damage them? And then what does that feel like?
Yeah, so naturally on a day-to-day basis, mitochondria, through the energy production process, will produce a small amount of free radicals. And so, that's going to, over time, create rust inside the mitochondria. But they become damaged by a number of environmental toxicants. And so mold and mycotoxins are at the top of the list. Non-native EMFs, so 5G, Wi-Fi, things of that nature, will also damage it. Chemo and radiation will significantly damage the mitochondria. And then people have heard of the fluoroquinolone antibiotics because they can cause tendon ruptures, but more importantly, they can cause what's mostly considered permanent mitochondrial damage. And so, this gets into epigenetics, but there are 2 bodyguards for the mitochondria. One is SOD, superoxide dismutase. And if you've ever seen the infomercials for Cindy Crawford's skincare line, that's what Dr. Zavak has in that product of hers. It's SOD. And glutathione, your body's most powerful antioxidant. And so if you have polymorphisms in these two pathways where you don't make enough of them or you don't recycle them well, then that leaves the mitochondria more susceptible to damage.
All right. So I'm going to do maybe a little translation because you are super smart. Okay. So when your mitochondria are exposed to, so 5G and Wi-Fi, I know lots of physicians that talk about turning off Wi-Fi at night or at least getting as far away from your Wi-Fi as you can at night. I know I put my phone on airplane mode at night because the clock will still work, the alarm will still work, but nothing else, no other signals get past. And so, okay, so that's one thing. We talked about chemotherapy and radiation therapy. That's significant, right? But now you're talking about two major combatants that our bodies make, actually, superoxide dismutase and glutathione. And so, and what's cool about it is our bodies use raw materials that's in our nutrition, right? In our food. And when we eat a poor diet, we don't have the materials to make it. And when we can't make it, then we can't fight off oxidative stress. So oxidative stress. So when you cut an apple open and you lay it on the counter and you walk away and you come back and it's brown, that's oxidative stress, right? That's the rust you're talking about in our bodies, right? It's such a great word because we don't understand it until we see it. And I think an apple is always a great example of it, or a avocado, right? That browning, that's the aging process happening. It's just rapid in fruits. And so that's what happens inside of our bodies. And so our bodies use superoxide dismutase. I know it sounds so weird. It sounds foreign. It almost sounds like you're landscaping terms, but it actually is what's cleaning things up inside of you. It's what's preventing damage from just everyday things. And everyday things are working out too much, right? I will tell you, I know a lot of people that I will almost put in the realm of addicted to exercise. And I feel like they are sick more often. I feel like, I mean, dare I say it, I see cancer a little more frequently in those heavily addicted populations. And it's because we make garbage with everything we do, right? And garbage isn't bad. That's why we have a waste system to get rid of it. But if you can't get rid of it, if you don't have enough superoxide dismutase or glutathione, or you don't process it well, and we find out if you process it well because it's in your genes, we can tell kind of if you're predisposed to not processing it well. You're saying that will actually damage your mitochondria and will lead to long-term dysfunction.
Yeah, if you have low levels of either of those compounds, your mitochondria are exponentially more susceptible to damage, because remember, they don't have those histone bodyguards.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about things that can damage it, like over-exercising, there are a few stats that, jump out to me about exercise from the medical literature, or that, over-exercising, overtraining suppresses something called secretory IgA, which protects our mucosal membrane. So our nose, our mouth, our microbiome, our urinary tracts. So women who have chronic urinary tract infection, that would be considered a multifocal dysbiosis. So
and that's your immune system is what you're saying. It affects your immune system.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the connection with what I described. That's interesting. I love it.
And just as a quick anecdote, my cousin, she's an avid runner, and she had trouble conceiving, and they were looking into adopting. And of course, you can't be a prophet in your own kingdom. So they think I'm a quack. But I said, you need to cut out the running or cut way, way back on it. Because she literally had, no body fat. And so that's nature's way of saying, hey, you need to change something. And so, I think when people are addicted to exercise, they're either low in serotonin, or they think they can out-exercise their stressors. But they forget that exercise in itself is a stressor, It's a good stressor when done appropriately, but it's still a stressor.
That's super helpful, man. And that's a really good message because I think, again, men and women are in this constant pursuit of changing the way they look on the outside and then, exercise has an addictive quality to it, which is why when we make it a habit long term, it feels good and you can't go without it, right? It does have that component. So it's absolutely possible to overdo it. And so interesting that it has the opposite effect, right? Like you can damage your mitochondria and then you don't have enough energy. So that in and of itself is fascinating, and certainly a proponent of the idea that, or an example of the idea that everything in moderation, right? So
Exactly.
that makes a lot of sense. All right, so what does it look like if you have damaged mitochondria? Because you made a comment to me before about all disease, and that was like, whoa.
Yeah, so when we look at, all syndromes, symptoms, imbalances, and diseases, what they have in common, two things. One, mitochondrial dysfunction, and the other is glutathione, low levels of glutathione. And
Which
those
kind of
two
go
kind
hand
of
in hand.
work
Yeah.
exactly. And so one of my mentors talks about mitochondrial buckets. And so when you start to repair and heal your mitochondria, your body's going to prioritize it. So for example, our brain is between 7 to 9% of our total body weight, but it consumes about 22% of our energy and oxygen consumption. So you have a handful of mitochondria doing a lot of work. So the first place mitochondrial dysfunction shows up is brain fog. Okay. And then the second thing would be cardiac dysfunction. And it could be hypertension, it could be insulin resistance, it could be poor ejection fraction. There is a cardiologist, I think he's in Ohio, and he does VO2 max testing, which is, exercise, treadmill, stress test, to measure improvements in mitochondrial function.
Wow. That's heavy stuff, right? So we control this. Our mitochondria are something we control. And it's interesting because I think, women over 40, brain fog. Brain fog is one of those symptoms that it ends up in a bucket because nearly everybody experiences it. And very often you don't even know you have it because it's like the frog in the water. Like just over time, you start to lose your capacity for quick thinking and remembering and memory recall and cognition. And so if you have people around you that remind you of this or say, hey, you just asked me that, right? Like start paying attention to signs maybe that you could have like early signs of mitochondrial dysfunction. That's remarkable. And then it leads to chronic disease. So this is how it starts. This is a warning sign. And then it leads to chronic disease. So then what do we tell people? What do we tell people that are just sitting out there listening to us and say, oh my God, that sounds like me, right? Because I know like brain fog, okay, people say that's their thyroid, right? That's like one of the signs of hypothyroidism, or brain fog is one of the signs of an imbalanced hormones, right? Sex steroids. So how do we tease all this out?
Yeah, after a certain age or due to certain stressors, our hormones will decline. But if you improve the overall function of your mitochondria, it increases hormonal output. So the endocrine system works better. And so it turns out that the thyrocytes in the thyroid are very, very sensitive to oxidative stress. And so they get damaged by free radicals. They get attacked through something called molecular mimicry. Basically, you have pathogens like Epstein-Barr or Yersinia from the gut that will trick your immune system into attacking your thyroid. But in terms of, if you just have brain fog and let's say, you've had your hormones checked and they're optimal, you've been working on them, and now you want to work on your mitochondria. One connection that's totally free to work on, And this has been proven through research, but it's the mind mitochondria connection. So we know stress is harmful in a zillion different ways. But one of the ways that's proven is, so, if someone came in and started yelling at me, within 3 to 5 minutes, my mitochondria start decreasing their energy output. And so that's extremely significant. And that's one reason why stress makes you so tired, is because it's decreasing your mitochondrial function.
Oh, I got to tell you. All right, look, I'm going to drop my pen. I can't drop the mic. It's attached to my head. That is huge. All of what you just said. I mean, there's a lot there. Let's start with hormones, right? It's kind of a chicken and the egg. Even clinicians that I've worked with for a decade always think like thyroid is the root of this, right? Like, oh, it could be their thyroid causing this. What you're saying is the very, very, very root, when we reduce all the noise, is your mitochondria, and that they are responsible for even thyroid function, right? When we talk about hormones improving, when we improve our mitochondria, ding, 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 right? When we exercise, our hormones get better through this channel. This is wild. So, okay, so there's that was like massive aha moment. The next one is your mind. Like, holy cow, the idea that just an acute stress, someone coming in and yelling at you, will change the way you make energy. Right? Think about that, everybody. We think of emotions as feelings, and they're not. They're biochemistry, right? And so think of, oh, I'm so guilty of this. I'm going to start crying. I'm so guilty of this. Like, when you're stressed, we think about the cortisol impact. Again, that's a hormone. Hello. But we think about how that changes our health and our long-term health. But what you've just done, Dr. Tim, is you've drawn a really hard line that connects your mitochondria to your long-term health, and bypasses everything in the middle that we always blame for what could lead to long-term health, right? Like stress and sleep are bad for your long-term health. You're like, they're bad for your mitochondria. And that's like the bullet train to bad health or good health.
You can do many things for your mitochondria, but if you're chronically stressed, those efforts are going to be negated. And so, it goes back to, I mean, it's especially relevant now with increased anxiety and depression. My colleagues that work in hospitals tell me, the psych units are overflowing. Cardiovascular units are overflowing because people are stressed and having heart attacks or strokes. And so the mitochondria, mindset is extremely important. And what I tell my patients is every thought has a physiological consequence. And so, whether we realize it or not, it takes a lot of inner work. I mean, I'm a work in progress, but bringing your subconscious, because we all have these tapes playing in our heads, telling us things. And if those are negative things, then your mitochondria are getting negative signals.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And hello, right? Oh, this is going to be huge. So we know historically that ancestor or lineage of Holocaust survivors, like, let's really think about the ultimate like stressor in the world, right? And there are so many studies done on Holocaust survivors and families and genetics and what we know, right? Like, there's a connection there, especially if mitochondria is passed on, right? Mm-hmm. And so not only are you born with the mitochondria that lived through stress, that's been passed down through genetics, through generations of stress, but that alters future health.
Yeah, and I'm going to use a big term, but then I'll explain it. So there's something called transgenerational epigenetic trauma. Yep. And when I first started studying epigenetics back in 2011, the prevailing thought that was that, what happens to us will affect up to 4 generations after us. Now the research is showing more like 12 to 13 generations.
Wow. I mean, if there is anything, knowing that biochemical physical impact on future generations. I mean, first of all, if anyone, trauma is so common. Emotional, physical trauma is so common in the world. And so knowing that your own responsibility, not only to yourself, to find a path to healing. And we talk about it in the future. In the past, we will have guests coming on, but the idea that emotional trauma, you can't sweep it under the rug, because
Right.
it moves forward in your generational line. It doesn't just end with you. So you have to end it.
Exactly.
That's
exactly.
amazing. That's amazing. Okay, so we've covered, wow. This is like literally a bullet train. It's awesome. So we covered what are mitochondria.
Mhm.
We covered how you get more of them, right? And the
Mhm.
big message there is, gosh, exercise in moderation. High intensity interval training is good. Cardio 3 times a week, but with weight training and alternate is good. That's helpful. We talked about molecular hydrogen, as this explains why you've been on Ben Greenfield's podcast and the Bulletproof Executive podcast, because this is biohacking stuff we're talking about here. And there's not
Right.
a good term for biohacking for women. So I'm on the mission to find that. So if you come up with one, we should put our heads together on it.
All right.
So then we learned how mitochondria get damaged, right?
Mhm.
So our environment, our stress, our food choices, our lack of superoxide dismutase and lack of glutathione, and that could be genetic. And then we learned about what it looks like. It starts with brain fog and has this spiral effect. And then, man, I dropped my pen and everything happened, because we drew dark lines that said, when your mitochondria are damaged, forget about all these root causes that we talk about all the time, like your thyroid and your uh, uh, hormones and your insulin resistance and all of these other things. That's the root there. Go further back, go further upstream, because it's all coming from mitochondrial.
I will say that, the communication between thyroid and mitochondria is bidirectional. So if you can have very good or extremely good mitochondria, and if your thyroid, for whatever reason, is not performing well, then your mitochondrial function will decrease. So it is two-way.
It's like the mitochondria. We've always thought of mitochondria as being factories that, they switch on, they switch off, but they're smart. They respond. They modulate based on what's going on. So, gosh, if there's any reason to get off your couch, that was it right there, man. Like, what a message. So, holy cow, that's amazing. I'm very rarely do I not have words, but I just drew some connections that I've never made before. And there are millions of them out there, but when they hit me hard. This was amazing. I'm so glad so Dr. Tim, uh, this is scratching the surface of his knowledge. Like, we couldn't decide what to talk about because he knows so much. He has a website called healyourbody.org. Definitely check that out. I mean, again, we barely scratched even what he can riff on for days. I would love for you to come back and we can just talk all about epigenetics one day.
Yeah.
I think you do an amazing job of taking these super difficult ideas and just making them really simple to understand and actionable, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, this was a great, interactive, informative interview.
Yeah, great. Okay, so now we know what to do. I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day, sharing this massive bomb on us of health. And again, when we talk about evolving ageless, we talk about small changes that can have a big impact. We're not talking about radically changing your life overnight to become ageless. And one of these things is like, even if you get your heart rate up 3 times a week, you're changing your mitochondria. Even if you're about to blow your lid because your kids have left their clothes all over the floor, or their clothes are in the washing machine, picking up mildew, and you're mad, you got to take a breath and you got to come down out of the tree, right? Because you're just hurting your long-term health and long-term generations. So thank you so much for sharing this with us today. This was
Thank you for having me.
eye-opening.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
This is great. All right. So that was huge, wasn't it? And so next week, we are joined by another expert on another topic, but I just want you to think about today and really think about how you can bring that in to your own life, any one of these small changes, and just have a huge impact on the way you age. So again, thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining Dr. Tim, everyone. And I will see you the same time next week. Keep on living ageless. Bye for now.